A ruthless HOA tried to force disabled senior Rebecca Lowe to tear down her only wheelchair ramp. At the heart of it stood Diane Culver, a president known for targeting anyone who didn't fit her vision of visual harmony. But when Jason called in family friend Mayor Evelyn Grant, the balance of power shifted in an instant. And just wait until you hear how this showdown ended, and why justice, at last, prevailed. Rebecca Lowe had never been one to cause trouble. At 62, she was still adjusting to her new reality. A massive stroke had robbed her of much of her mobility the previous year, leaving her reliant on a wheelchair and her son's daily help. But she wasn't one to surrender to circumstances. With weeks of therapy behind her and a stubborn streak her family knew well, Rebecca was determined to regain as much independence as possible. That's why Jason, her son, had spent 2 weekends carefully building a wheelchair ramp off the front porch of her single-story Florida home. The ramp wasn't flashy. Jason had matched the wood stain to the porch and added railings for safety. It blended naturally with the house and occupied no more space than necessary. For Rebecca, it meant freedom. She could finally wheel herself out to check the mail, sit on the porch, or simply feel the sun on her face without waiting for someone to lift her down the front steps. That small victory was short-lived. One quiet morning, a plain envelope arrived in her mailbox. No greeting, no warning, just an official HOA letterhead stamped across the top. Rebecca unfolded the paper, her hands trembling as she read, "Unapproved structure, fine issued, must be removed." The fine was already set at $500, with the threat of additional penalties if compliance wasn't met within 10 days. At first, she thought there had to be some mistake. Surely no one would demand the removal of a medically necessary ramp. Surely common sense would prevail. But then her eyes landed on the signature, Diane Culver, president of the HOA board. Rebecca knew the name well. Diane had gained a reputation in the neighborhood as a ruthless enforcer of HOA codes. She prided herself on keeping the community visually uniform, and had once fined another resident for having a flagpole that was an inch taller than allowed. And now, it seemed, Diane had set her sights on Rebecca's ramp. When Jason read the letter, his face turned red with disbelief. Without hesitation, he gathered every document he could think of. His mother's physician's letter recommending the ramp, a copy of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA provisions on reasonable accommodations, and photos clearly showing the ramp was safe, unobtrusive, and entirely on their property. That afternoon, Jason marched into the HOA office, documents in hand. Diane was there, seated behind a large desk stacked with file folders. Jason calmly laid out the paperwork and explained the situation. Her response was ice cold. "You didn't submit an architectural request," she said with a tight, knowing smile. "Rules are rules. That ramp comes down." Jason stood there for a moment, stunned. In her tone, there was no misunderstanding. This wasn't about safety, legality, or community standards. This was about control, and about one person's relentless grip on it. As he left the office, one thing was clear. This wasn't over. News of what had happened to Rebecca spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some residents were furious, appalled that the HOA would target a disabled senior for something so basic, so necessary. A few sent supportive messages to Jason or quietly expressed their sympathy, but most remained silent. Everyone knew how things worked in this neighborhood. Diane Culver didn't just enforce the rules, she weaponized them. Her grip on the HOA board was absolute. If you crossed her, you could expect endless citations, mounting fines, and years of petty harassment. People had seen it happen before. Now, they were seeing it happen again. This time, to Rebecca Lowe. Jason refused to back down. He called the HOA's lawyer and submitted an emergency appeal. He contacted a local ADA compliance office. He even reached out to the board members one by one, pleading for common sense to prevail. Each attempt hit the same wall. Rejection. The board stands by its decision. Meanwhile, the pressure intensified. Within a week, the original $500 fine doubled, with a fresh notice citing non-compliance. But Diane wasn't finished. HOA volunteers, emboldened by her lead, began circling Rebecca's property like hawks. They took photos at all hours, snapshots of her lawn, her porch, even her windows. Soon, more violation notices arrived. Weeds along walkway, chipped paint on window trim, exterior clutter visible from street. It was a transparent campaign of harassment, designed to break Rebecca's spirit and force Jason to comply. For Rebecca, already struggling with fatigue and the lingering effects of her stroke, the pressure was unbearable. She grew afraid to leave her house. Even rolling out onto the porch made her anxious, knowing eyes were watching. Her sleep worsened. Her blood pressure spiked dangerously. Jason had to rush her to the doctor twice in 1 week. Seeing his mother, once so determined, now gripped by fear, infuriated Jason beyond words. Then came the final blow. One evening, returning from the pharmacy, Jason found a large red notice taped directly to the ramp. Mandatory removal in 48 hours or HOA will contract removal services. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a countdown. They were going to tear down the ramp, Rebecca's only safe exit from her home, by force. Jason stood on the porch, fists clenched, heart pounding. The hatred building inside him had reached its peak. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was personal, and he wasn't going to let them win. Jason wasn't about to let it happen, not without a fight. But time was slipping away. The removal crew had been scheduled. The HOA's notice gave them full clearance to arrive the next morning, with or without consent. The thought of strangers dismantling the one thing his mother relied on made Jason's stomach turn. He had exhausted every normal channel. Appeals, lawyers, even ADA offices were tangled in red tape that moved far too slowly. Desperation pushed him to think outside the box. That's when a name came to mind, one he hadn't considered before: Evelyn Grant. Mayor Evelyn Grant wasn't just a public official. She had been a friend of the Lowe family for decades, long before politics, long before strokes and wheelchairs and HOA battles. Jason took a breath and dialed her personal number. Evelyn answered almost immediately. When Jason explained what had happened, her voice shifted from friendly to alarmed in seconds. "They're threatening to tear down a medically required ramp," she said sharply. "That violates every principle of the ADA and basic decency. Don't worry, Jason. I know exactly how to handle this." Hanging up, Jason felt the first flicker of hope he'd had in days, but anger still burned hot beneath it. This wasn't about bureaucracy anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who had gone too far. Morning arrived fast. At exactly 8 a.m., a white utility truck rumbled down Rebecca's street, parking in front of her house. 2 men in contractor uniforms stepped out, glancing up at the ramp. One checked a clipboard. Moments later, Diane Culver herself arrived, polished and purposeful. Clipboard in hand, blazer buttoned tight, an HOA badge pinned to her lapel. She strode up the walkway, head held high, ready to supervise the removal as if it were just another day's business. What she didn't expect was what happened next. Barely 5 minutes later, the sound of additional engines echoed down the street. 3 city vehicles appeared: a marked city compliance van, a municipal legal team's car, and an unmarked sedan that pulled up right behind Diane's SUV. Out of that sedan stepped Mayor Evelyn Grant, calm, composed, and clearly in command. Diane's confident smile faltered the moment she saw her. The balance of power on that quiet suburban street had just shifted, and Jason could feel it in the air. Mayor Evelyn Grant stepped out of the sedan with steady purpose. 2 city attorneys followed close behind her, along with a uniformed ADA compliance officer. The small crowd that had gathered, curious neighbors, a few HOA volunteers, even some of the contractors, watched as the mayor approached. The air was tense, the morning sun sharp against the scene unfolding. Diane straightened her blazer and stepped forward, clipboard in hand. But her earlier confidence seemed to waver. Mayor Grant's voice was calm, but carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "You are in violation of federal law," Evelyn said, her gaze fixed on Diane. You will cease all actions against this residence immediately. If you or your contractors touch this ramp, you will face personal and organizational liability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Cameras and phones were already out, neighbors documenting every word, every reaction. Diane opened her mouth, then shut it again. Finally, she stammered, This ramp is unsightly. It wasn't approved by our architectural committee. It doesn't fit the visual harmony standards of our community." Before she could continue, the ADA compliance officer stepped forward, voice clear and unwavering. "A mobility ramp for a disabled resident is a federally protected accommodation," he said. "Your aesthetic preferences hold no legal standing here. You are ordered to stand down. Now!" For a long moment, Diane stood frozen, lips pressed tight. Then, without a word, she turned on her heel and walked quickly back toward her car. The contractors packed up their tools. The crowd lingered, buzzing with whispers and quiet satisfaction. Word spread through the community within hours. Several HOA board members, unwilling to be caught in the fallout, tendered their resignations that same week. Jason, with legal help from the city and newly engaged civil rights attorneys, filed personal lawsuits against Diane and the HOA for harassment and ADA violations. The case would take time, but the message had already been delivered loud and clear. As for the ramp, it stayed. That weekend, the mayor herself returned with city staff. They repainted the ramp in fresh protective stain and mounted a small bronze plaque at its base. ADA-compliant mobility ramp, protected under federal law. That evening, with Jason beside her, Rebecca rolled down the ramp for the first time in days, no longer in fear, but with tears of quiet relief. Neighbors stood by, some applauding softly as she passed. Justice had not only come, it had done so publicly, unmistakably, for all to see.